Well, good evening and welcome. We're going to be starting 4 different addresses tonight. And, when I started with William Wilberforce, I didn't think there'd be that much to talk about, but boy, now I'm worried about getting it all in. To start with, William Wilberforce doesn't come to your mind first when you think of reformers. And this is, after all, the month of October, and the title of this series is Reformation Celebration. And that's because William Wilberforce was not a theologian. And we aren't even sure exactly where he stood on certain specific doctrines. But that is really beside the point. If we define Reformation, not just in terms of returning to the gospel, but also in terms of changing history, of projecting the gospel out to mankind, Wilberforce almost comes to the very top of the list. Now, we have studied Luther, and we've studied Calvin, and we've studied Knox, and we've studied the Puritans and the Covenanters, and we've studied last year Witherspoon, and all of these men were movers and shakers in society, not just in the church. And so when it comes to the age now we are in, Wilberforce really does stand on their shoulders. And so that's why I wanted to give time to him tonight. Now, you all know probably that Wilberforce was singularly significant in changing and altering the course of slavery and the slave trade. I will not have a whole lot of time to go into the background of that. I did that 2 years ago. And if you want to refresh your mind on the history of slavery in the history of mankind, you can go onto my website. This was from 2 years ago when we studied the Puritans. And you go on my website, and down at the bottom you'll see the 2023 Reformation Celebration. Click on William Wilberforce, and up pops the page, and you scroll down to the bottom, and you click on Review, the historical background of slavery, and that's my hour-long presentation on that I gave 2 years ago. And you can see that I did it as a polemic against CRT, against the idea that the evil white man started slavery in the 17th century. That is far from being the truth. And so if you would refresh your mind on that before next week, it would help immensely in terms of your ability to really understand what's going on. Now, what we're going to do tonight is set the context for this by describing Wilberforce's world. We're going to start with the fruits of the New World. The fruits of the New World. Remember that the revelations of the 15th century, by the beginning of the 1400s, Europe, and what I mean by Europe is France and England and Spain and Portugal, just discovered Africa below the Sahara. They were completely ignorant of that before. But now there was the whole brave new land all the way down past the Sahara, and it was of course filled, it was populated, but it was a whole land that was completely brand new. By the end of the 1400s, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered, thank you. Is it going to be like this all night, Janet? By 1492, Columbus had discovered the West Indies and the Bahama Islands and the areas to this directly in line with Central America, and all of the European countries now had frontiers galore. Not only do their compasses work for them, not only their maps work now. Before they discovered the Americas, there was some sense that the world was round, but they couldn't make the map work. because they were missing the whole continent of the Americas. Now everything fell into place. Now they could figure out what was going on, and they were ready to explore the world and to chart all the different maps that they could do. They jumped at the opportunity to do that, and that's not only France and England, and Portugal and Spain and all of these nations that had come originally out of the Holy Roman Empire. Now were independent countries, and that's a key to what they did. They were all independent countries, and they were all after the new land. They were all after the new land. There wasn't just a concerted effort, not we'll work on this together. It was go, and everybody was running to explore what was left. The exploration there, in other words, was worldwide. They sent the queen and the kings would send ships north, south, east, west, and they would send them all over trying to find things and claim those lands for the potential that was there and to chart those lands, and it was extremely competitive. The routes were calculated, the footholds were established. What I mean by that is they would land, they would set up a trading post with the peoples that live there, and then slowly over time those trading posts would become little towns, and before you know it they were as cities, and their government was represented there, and before you know it they were in control of everything that they were discovering. So after exploration came exploitation. This was again a very competitive business. Such trips originally were financed by the government. We're doing this for Spain. We're doing this for Europe, England rather. And we have pictures of Columbus, planting the Spanish flag because he finally got somebody to pay for his trip, and that happened to be Spain, Isabella in Spain. So he claimed the land for Spain. But after that, small independent businesses started to crop up, and they started sending their own guys out. And they didn't answer to the government, and they didn't answer to anybody else. They were out for the profit. They wanted, and originally it was gold and it was silver they were after. And if you remember from 2 years ago, I talked about how the conquistadors landed in Spain, in Central America, and went to the Aztecs and basically brutalized them, looking for gold and looking for silver. They just completely almost erased those peoples. Those early explorers that we all read about and studied about in history, the big names that we remember and we think of as heroes and champions, and courageous people, they were not that at all. These guys were money grubbers from the very beginning. They were gutsy. They had to be, because they were going into places unknown. But after they got there, they had to make it profitable for themselves and for the people that were sending them. They had to make it work. And so these explorers were all greedy. They were cruel. They were heartless in their motivation and in their pleasure. They abused the people, men and women alike, torturing them, trying to get answers out of them as to where the gold and silver is, and all of this other thing. They were brutal, and that is where the attitude about the New World started to set in. We're back in Europe. We're starting businesses, exploring the profit margins here. And what attitude do we have about these new peoples in the New World? Well, the explorers have already set the pace for that. Those people over there are there to be enslaved. They are there to be abused. They're there to be tortured until they give us their answers. The explorers set the course for how we were going to regard anybody they came across, anybody they found. It did not belong to them, it belonged to us. And that attitude stayed with us for the next several centuries, for the next several decades rather. And so that's, you wonder where all that starts. It doesn't start with race, it starts with greed. Just flat out greed and the profit margin. And that's where it all begins. So let's take a step back before we go farther and remind ourselves what the Bible says about what we are to be about in this world. The first thing we know is that God has given us a creation mandate. What's the creation mandate? The creation mandate is to go and have dominion over the world and subdue it. We are indeed to be in control of everything good that God has given. We are to be managing all of the minerals. We are managing all of the things we dig up, all of the things we manipulate. This is the world God has given us. It is a gift. It's a glorious gift, and we are in charge of it. We are given charge over it, and we are supposed to govern it as we answer to the Lord. But when we fell, as Genesis tells us, fallen man really falls into one of two categories historically. And this is also something that's very recognizable when you study the process of history. Fallen man wants either one of two things. He either wants to be dominating over others, and he's not satisfied until he dominates over other people. Or else he just wants to get along. He just wants to, boss tells me to do this and I do it. And I just want to live my life and I just want to have my way. We've fallen into one of two extremes. We either want to be in control or we want to just allow ourselves to be controlled. And those two syndromes just stay with us throughout history. And the other thing is that fallen man is always restless. God is not in the picture. We're not there to glorify God. And that is where, whenever Christians are involved, or people say we're coming with a Christian nation, a Christian world and life view, but we show and demonstrate that what we really are after is profit and greed and increase at any cost. We are anything but Christian. And so fallen man is restless, he's corrupt, he's greedy. And as a result of that greed and that restlessness, kingdoms rise. Most of the kingdoms on earth have risen because of the power of man killing and beating and stomping on other people. It's always been king of the hill. It's always been an act of violence that creates nations. But just as nations are built out of violence, so they also fall. They fall out of corruption. And that, you could say, is where we possibly are in the United States right now. It is exceptional. Our nation is exceptional. But it started with war. We fought off the British. And, whatever you take of that, war was required in order for us to have what we wanted. But that was 250 years ago, and now corruption is throughout our government. And it's dreadful how deeply entrenched it has become. And we know that kingdoms fall when they grow corrupt. They get too top heavy and they fall. And that's what we possibly can expect here if things do not change. That was the condition, not now. That was the condition then. It would take something to change it. What would change it? The gospel and the Holy Spirit, who has always been faithful. When in God's providence, we need to have that turn again and again and again. And we've seen that in the men we've studied already so far. It takes the gospel, it takes the kingdom of God to challenge people's thinking and to remind them, hey, lay up your treasures in heaven. What are you doing? What are you doing all this? Lay up your treasures in heaven. That's what Jesus says. So there is no contradiction in seeking out the creation mandate and answering the call of Jesus. We are to be about the business of ruling and managing this world, but we are not about the business of denying the gospel and raping the country and its people. Okay, getting back to the fruits of the new world, those early explorers were originally after gold and silver. Remember the Aztecs? That was originally it. There's cities of gold. There's mines of gold. There's rivers of gold. There's gold out there. We just have to find it. And when they couldn't find it, they tortured the people to tell them where it was. And when that didn't work, they went back frustrated. But it didn't take long before they realized gold and silver may not be there in abundance, but we've found something better. Commodities. Commodities is the gift that never stops giving. It's commodities that will be the gold and the silver that will make the engines run for the next couple of centuries. And the first of those commodities was sugar. Now, sugar had been known in the East since 4,000 years before Christ, so it was not new there. But it hit Europe hard in the 15th century. All of a sudden, sugar was the rage. Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, so she was mostly in the 1500s. And when she died, she was buried with a whole mouth of rotted out teeth because she loved sugar. And they didn't know anything about toothbrushes. So kids, brush your teeth. Sugar was introduced to Europe in the 15th century. By 1770, it was the most valuable commodity. You couldn't get enough. You couldn't sell enough. You couldn't ship enough into Europe to satisfy the craving they had for sugar. Just 1 year after Columbus's first voyage, Columbus sails out again, and this time he's taking something to the West Indies. He's taking sugarcane. And he says, plant this here. We know this is the right kind of climate for this. And it booms all of a sudden. It's natural in the West Indies. This is great. And by 1540, the Portuguese introduced sugarcane to Brazil in South America, where there was even more land and more profit potential. Into Cuba and into Jamaica, and before 1550 there were 3,000 sugar mills throughout the New World processing sugar as fast as they could to get that commodity to England and to France because they could sell it at whatever price they asked. The second commodity was tobacco. Tobacco was discovered there. That's Sir Walter Raleigh in heaven. He's having a great old time, and tobacco was all of a sudden just one of the things that men had to have. It was completely unknown in Europe. First introduced by Spain in 1528. The demand and the profitability of it exploded by the 17th and 18th centuries. If there was anything that the European peoples had, it was a lust for pleasure. They loved their taste buds, and they loved their smoking devices, and they just had to have more. And you would think that things like that might peak and go down. No, the craving just grew and grew and grew. But then third in chronological line as well, was cotton. Cotton was first introduced to Europe through the East. The Huns had it before Europe had it. Christopher Columbus, when he discovered America, he found the peoples wearing cotton clothing. What's this? And by 1760, the European Industrial Revolution kicks in because of cotton. And by the middle of the 1800s, cotton is king. Now, that Industrial Revolution, maybe you didn't realize, it started as early as it did, 1760. That's earlier than I thought it was. And, of course, we don't have any pictures of it. This is of a later revolution, Industrial Revolution, but it gives you an idea of the kind of ways that these huge machines were built and that people were employed. those mills, those sugar mills, had to have parts and had to have metal parts in order to work them, and other equipment. They introduced water power and steam power and mechanized factories, tools, textiles, metallurgy. There was a demand for coal that intensified in the factories in England particularly, for water, for workers, for minerals, materials, banking, business acumen, engineering, construction. These were the good days to be in France and in England, because things were booming like crazy. Show you a couple other pictures. Again, there was no photography during that period of time, but child labor was beginning to be rampant. The poor would have large families, and they would send all their kids into the factories, even at the youngest ages, to work in the factories. 16-hour days, 6 days a week. And they just employed everybody because they paid so little. They had to have everybody working in order to have enough money to buy food. The factories became more and more complex, more and more accident prone. No protections, no safety guards. You would get caught, and that's your problem. And so it became a brutal and oppressive system, because again, the demand for it was just great. And textiles were the main engine of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't tobacco, and it wasn't sugar. It was textiles. Why? Because women had to have their fashions. And now we could dress like the people in France and have all these layers and beautiful clothing and everything. And the demand was high, and all of that came from the mills. All of that came from the textile mills as the people just labored and labored and labored. And of course, pollution. The coal plants were burning coal constantly, and pollution covered particularly London. I remember going over to Scotland, to England, and going through Greyfriars. Greyfriars is a church with a city graveyard around it, and in those days you would have rather large monuments for your family gravestones, and they were all dark and blackened and looked spooky and ancient, like they'd been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. They weren't that old. They were just covered in black coal dust, and it had ruined them. And the pollution was absolutely dreadful. Profits, because of this, soared. Of course, that was the driving force and engine. Profits soared, wealth increased. Remember this, ladies, when you watch Pride and Prejudice. It's more going on than just fancy girls in their nice outfits, and this is what England was like. No. That is what the upper crust was like. That is what the very few upper crust people were like. And they lived in nothing but the most lavish of places, and celebrated their lifestyles and their entertainments and their preoccupations and their travel. They had nothing else to do but to fill their time with amusement and with walking in their vast acreages. And how wonderful, isn't this wonderful? It was the beginning of the gentlemen's clubs in London. In those days, there was no porn. In those days, there was gambling, and there was smoking, and there was only men allowed, and so business would transpire in gentlemen's clubs, and this all began to come to the surface, and people, and there were several gentlemen's clubs, and you could only be a part of it if you were just part of the hoity-toity, and enjoy that kind of upper scale lifestyle. And they also cruised. Cruising is not a new phenomenon. They would get on sailboats and they would cruise in their lovely fashions and everything. And they would have just the grandest time sailing up and down the rivers and enjoying themselves. It was a time of great wealth and great riches, and it was a time of enjoying life for all it was worth. There is a book that was written in 1776 by Adam Smith called The Wealth of Nations. It was a pinnacle book describing the engine of capitalism in this day and age. It's classic. It's required still in many economics courses. And if you have any interest, you might want to pick that up and read it. It's amazing. The other side of the coin, however, was just downright deep poverty. And when you have nothing but poverty, you have drinking. There was a drink created in the 17th century by the Dutch. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I'll throw it out there. It called it Genever, whatever. But it's soon but the English called it Madame Geneva as kind of a manipulation of the term. Finally just reduced itself to gin. Now gin is a little different today than it was then. First of all, it was horrible, but they would add to the taste with some seeds and into the mix and make it flavorful, but it was cheap. Oh, it was so cheap. And it became the poor man's drink. And it became voluminous. You had all kinds of people making gin all over Europe. By the early 18th century, it was cheap and commonly produced in England, growing from 500,000 gallons a year to 11 million gallons in just one particularly measured time. As one author says, London was drinking herself to death. Now I want you to remember that as we talk about anything else going on, because the motivation for people for the vast majority of people in this age is extremely limited. They will never see those fancy dresses. They will never wear those. They will never be in those gentlemen's clubs. They will never be on those cruises. This is life for them, and it's easier if I just drown myself than even bother thinking about it. It was extremely popular in the first grand and anonymous city, which London became, growing rapidly with the poor. This is a very classic cartoon that describes or depicts the age. It's called Gin Lane, and right in the center is the effect it has on the children or the innocents, as the mother lets go of her child to get her latest dip of snuff. You've got the pawn shop over here. You've got the bartering over here. You've got people dying of, that's London. That's what's driving this incredible age of wealth and industry at the same time. The poor were abused and disregarded. If you were poor and you had to work for a living, that was your problem. Nobody really cared. Working conditions were slavish and cruel. Men, women, and children all worked all day. There was no thought for safety. There was no thought for sanitation, human decency. Living conditions were miserable. Dwellings were overcrowded and disregarded, and many lived on the streets hand to mouth. Is this a Christian nation? Is this what you think of? Mm-hmm. This is Europe, right? Unbelievable is what it was, The upper echelons was just the simple few. They were the nobilities. The landowners were on top. The gentry below them were the baronets. Those were titles that you inherited. Knights, squires, gentlemen. Those were if you grew up in a rich house and your daddy was rich and had a title, then you would get a title from him, and you would spend all of your time doing nothing. You would spend your entire life doing nothing. It was a grand way to live. Below them were merchants and professional men. These were the ones who were investing and driving the poor. They were the ones who were manipulating and causing the industrial revolution to continue. You had the freeholders and the smallholders down here who were just managers. And then, of course, the laboring poor. And that's the vast majority of those that were in Europe and England at the time. You've seen pictures of how decrepit the conditions in England was, and in many ways. And it was everything you would think it was. It was pretty bad. The church was no help. The church was no help. This was the Anglican Church. This was the church that was the state church. You remember back to Henry VIII, when he left the Roman Catholic Church, he formed the Anglican Church, and the Anglican Church was the state church. Everybody's going to be Anglican. And, in a sense, it almost became a government job to be a minister, to have anything to do with controlling the church, of running the church. And so if your job was guaranteed, and if your job was paid for, and you didn't try very hard, and the gospel was just standard issue, it was going to church every week was the fulfillment of your Christian obligation. A couple of quotations: the church of the 18th century was mired in a period of place-seeking, money-grabbing, and moral irrelevance. There was no morality in the church to speak of. It was a place and a circumstance of complete ignoring of the call of Christ to live as a Christian. The titles that you would get, like I candidated here and became pastor of this church, and I would get the fee for that, or the payment for that every year. But then I would turn around and hire some other person to do all the preaching for me, so that I didn't have to bother with the people. And then I would go and I would apply for a pastorate in another province and become a pastor there, do the same thing there, and now I'm sitting pretty with two salaries. This was standard. This was standard as to how the church ran. And one quotation is from a guy who says, I went to virtually every well-known church in London. And he said, not one of the sermons of the city's well-known preachers contained more Christianity than the writings of Cicero, which of course is an insult to the gospel. Pastors aspired to be lucrative, even multiple parishes, and then completely neglecting their duties. They had nothing to do with it. Their sermons were, if anything, were philosophical statements, rhetorical conversations, exercising and demonstrating your educational ability. There wasn't anything about your need to be saved. That, of course, was assumed because you were Anglican. Now, in the midst of that, of course, that being Anglican didn't suit everybody. And there were sparks of those who rebelled against it. We've talked before about nonconformists. John Bunyan was a nonconformist. He would not conform to the Anglican Church. There were others that would just simply say, this is not, I want to preach the gospel, but this is crazy. I don't want to be a part of the Church of England. Two men during this period of time, 1729, in Oxford, named Wesley, John and Charles, decided that they wanted to stir the people up. They wanted to start a real association. They didn't call it a church. They call it a club. And we want to grow as Christians. We want to explore the Christian life. We want to really understand what it means to be a Christian in the real sense of the term. And so they said, now, in order to do this, we want to we not only want to be disciplined ourselves, but we want to hold each other accountable. And so this was a challenge that was fresh and that was new and was weird to some people. But they said, let's explore this because we want to become disciples of Christ in the real sense of the term. So they formed a holy club, and this is a quote from that. It says, "To observe with strict formality the method of study and practice laid down in the statutes of the university, attend weekly class meetings, permit probing inquiries into one's daily routine," in other words, be accountable to somebody else, "honor the Lord's day, avoid drunkenness, uncharitable conversation, dressing in expensive outfits, singing songs or reading books that do not contribute to the knowledge and the love of God, softness or needless self-indulgence, to eat lightly, to go to bed early, and to rise early." Now you can, first that captures your imagination and you think, this is good. This is really good. And then you kind of sit back and you say, wait a minute, this is kind of structured. And is that real Christianity? But these guys, you have to remember, in the context of this, these guys were crawling out of a hole. They were discovering what it meant to be disciples of Christ all over again. So we give them credit. We give them credit for what they're doing because they want each other in the club to be real. None of this hypocritical stuff. Don't tell us you're a Christian and you don't follow through with how you disregard the Lord's Day, how you get drunk on Friday nights. You're going to do that, we're going to call you to account. And your willingness to be called to account was a big thing. That's important. It's called discipleship accountability. When I was a new Christian, that was one thing that made me grow like a weed, was being accountable to other Christians. It was amazing. It strengthened my seriousness and sobriety very fast. So that produced the rise of what was then called Methodism. Methodism was originally a derogatory term. Well, those guys are Methodists, they have a method for their madness. But it stuck, as many such titles do, and they became known as Methodists. And the practice was very, very different from what you would do in the Anglican church. And the Anglicans would look at the Methodists and say, you guys are really weird. One of the Methodists was George Whitefield. We heard about George Whitefield during the Puritans and his tour through the United States. But before he did that, he was part of the Holy Club, and he was involved with the Wesleys. But Whitefield went back to the Anglican Church. He said, that's where I think my calling is. And he also differed with the Wesleys in one other very important area. He was Calvinist in his theology. He believed in predestination. He was different than the Wesleys, who were Arminian in their choice. And again, it had to do more with the roots of the origin of their club. We choose to do this, and that was so much a part of who their club was. They could not deny, they couldn't shed that. But George Whitefield, remember, left England and came over to America, and he preached. And the people, the ministers even in the United States wouldn't let him in. So he preached in the fields. And his preaching in the fields to thousands of people raised up another phenomenon called evangelicalism. Now, evangelicalism is different than Methodism because there is no organization to evangelicalism. Now, it's more an individual relationship with God. There's no accountability to other people. You may very well be on fire for Christ, but it's not associated with any church. So evangelicals might go to this church, they might go to that church, they might go to everywhere else. That church is not identified as being an evangelical church. Evangelicalism is something you are individually. And so keep that distinction in mind as we go forward. One of those evangelical Anglicans turned out to be a man named John Newton. Now, Newton plays a very significant role. Some of you have seen the movie Amazing Grace. You need to be corrected a bit about Newton's role with Wilberforce in light of that movie. John Newton was a seaman since the age of 11. Seaman, in other words, part of a crew on a boat. If you showed up as part of the crew on a boat at the age of 11, it was because your mother couldn't control you anymore. You were violent, you were angry, you were untrustworthy, you were a worthless human being. Put you on a boat. Get rid of you. Bye. He was put on a boat. He was rebellious on the boat. He wouldn't follow orders. He was disciplined several times. He was then made a slave. Can't trust you with anything, going to put you in irons. Made a slave himself. His initial spiritual experience in 1748 was aboard the Greyhound. By this time he was up to being a captain. And it was a slave ship. Greyhound was a slave ship. He had hundreds of people downstairs in the holds rather. And a violent storm came up, scared him personally half to death. Didn't think of anybody else. Scared him personally half to death, and he cried out to the Lord for help. Seed planted, not conversion. He continued to work and invest in the slave trade. He continued to sail the boats. He continued to put his own money into the slave trade. He was profiting huge sums of money because it was a very profitable thing to do. But he suffered a stroke, a rather harsh stroke in 1754, and that made him quit sailing. He still stayed invested in the slave trade. He was finally ordained as a priest. He decided his conversion was now coming full circle, and when you did that, see, here's the issue. This will show up again with Wilberforce. When you took a dramatic conversion, you became an evangelical, born-again Christian, as we would say today. The only thing you could do was go into the pastorate. There wasn't any other outlet. There wasn't anything else that made any sense for you. You go to the church. You work for the church. That's the only alternative you had. That's what John Newton did. He said, "I'm a Christian. What should I do? I'm going to go into the priesthood," and he became an Anglican priest. He became an Anglican priest in 1764 in St. Peter and Paul in Olney. That will be, by the way, where he sees Wilberforce for the first time. Later, he becomes a rector at St. Mary and Woolnoth in London in 1779. That's when he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, and it'll be when he is at St. Mary Woolnoth that Wilberforce meets and comes and talks to him a second time. But he is not even an abolitionist himself until 1787, when he starts writing about it. And eventually, he is presented with a Doctor of Divinity from the College of New Jersey. Who's the president of that? What? No, it was just last year. Witherspoon. That's Witherspoon's college, and he's giving John Newton a doctorate of divinity. Pretty nice thing there. That finally brings us to our star of the year, Wilberforce. This is the world that Wilberforce is born into. He's born in Hull, England in 1759. That's not far from London. It's a little town, though. His grandfather was built up an enormous amount of wealth in the shipping trade, and his father was a merchant, so he was not as high up in that privilege scale as his grandfather. But between the two of them, he grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, as we say. He didn't hurt for anything. He had everything he wanted. Wilberforce was born a rather sickly child. You sometimes see pictures of Wilberforce as an adult, and it almost looks like he's effeminate in the way he sits and the way he poses and stuff like that. That's not the issue. His body was a problem for him his entire life, and he was never healthy and strong. When he was 9 years old, his dad died. His father died, and his mother was overwhelmed. So she sent William off to her sister, who lived in London, and it said, we didn't have a child, I don't think, and take care of William for rather long periods of time. Not maybe just the summers, but several months out of the year. And it was while William Wilberforce was with his aunt and uncle that his aunt shared with him that she was an evangelical. And we want you to meet the preacher in our town. And so they would take him to hear John Newton as a 9-year-old. And Newton took a shine to the boy, and they spent some hours together, and they walked in the woods, and they would talk. And young Wilberforce caught fire for evangelicalism. It was very interesting, but the aunt and the uncle really leaned more towards Methodism. They were just attracted to the Methodist structure. They liked the idea of a Christian lifestyle that was easily understood and dictated, and they started to cultivate this. And young William started to get a hold of this, and he started to say, "Yeah, this is nice. This is neat stuff." Eventually, his mother, who was an Anglican, caught wind of what her sister was doing and was appalled. "You're going to make a Methodist out of him." And so, bring him back. I don't want you polluting my kid. So she brought him back. And from that point on, William was able to be exposed to the wonderful social world of upscale Anglicanism, where nothing is restricted from you and everything is wonderful. And life just became a happy party for him as he was growing up in his teenage years. He quickly cooled to the idea of Methodism, dismissed it now as just moralistic living, I can do without that, and embraced the lifestyle that Anglicanism had to offer. And he entered St. John's College in Cambridge in 1774. Now, you might remember, Cambridge was the school of the Puritans 100 years ago. Now it is nothing. It is just a party school, just like the universities today are. And he had a grand time. But when he graduated, he went through the crisis that every college graduate has. What am I going to do with my life? Now, he didn't have to do anything. He was wealthy. He could have taken the business over from his father, but that didn't interest him at all. And most of his friends graduating from St. John's, were going into the ministry because that was easy living, nice pay, didn't have to worry about it. And he didn't want to do that either. So he didn't want to go into the ministry. He didn't want to take on the family business. He said, I'll try politics. Boy, what a choice, right? And then anyway. Well, Wilberforce was a natural at this. He loved being in front of people. He loved crowds. He loved parties. In college, he would throw parties and be the host with the mostest. He was everybody's favorite. He was a great conversationalist. He was delightful in every social aspect and everything. He gambled and he did all the fun things that kids do. And now he was a young adult and he did everything that he did not hold himself back from anything. But he was also a natural at becoming a very naturally gifted at speaking. He probably studied debate in college, and as a result, he learned how to formulate speeches and how to organize what he was going to say and to wait, and the whole business about knowing how to engage in a discussion, and all of that is so very important for a politician. And sure enough, it was a great thing for him to do. He quickly went back to his hometown of Hull, which was just a little bitty province, and not worth much in terms of the other powerful political regions. He ran for office, and he schmoozed his public wonderfully, and lo and behold, he got elected. He got elected. So now he's set. He's an MP. He's a member of Parliament. He's in the House of Commons. What a great life this is. And he goes to London and he sets up shop. And what does he do? He continues to party. And he continues to have to go to gambling places, and he continues to play cards. And he's just living we used to call it the life of Riley. That was from an old sitcom back in the 60s. He was living on top of the world. You couldn't do better than this. There was nothing left for him to achieve. Well, maybe there was. Maybe there was. Just like ministers would sometimes get double pulpits, sometimes members of Parliament would do the same thing. And he got his eye set on the neighboring parish of Yorkshire. Now, Yorkshire was a plum place. If you were the MP of Yorkshire, you were somebody. Hull was, Yorkshire would be, that's great. And to have them both, oh man. So he ran for office at Yorkshire, and believe it or not, he won. He was 24 years old now. 24 years old. And he's got the life. He doesn't have to work a day in his life. If he shows up for Parliament and votes, so what? He's got everything he could possibly need. He says, now I'm going to go cruising like everybody else, and I'm going to go smoke cigars in very fancy places. And one of the last things he does that I'm going to end with tonight is Parliament is taking a break, and he's decided he's going to go on a continental tour. I'm going to go to the French Riviera. I've never been to the French Riviera. I'm going to go to the French Riviera. And he takes his mother along. He takes two female cousins along. And he's starting to think to himself, this is going to drive me crazy. All these women. So I got to find somebody to go with that's a man who can talk with me. And he remembers an acquaintance from years back by the name of Milner. He wasn't even his first choice, but the first guy wasn't able to go. So he asked Milner to go with him. And he says, sure, I'll go with you. And that's where I'm going to end tonight, with Wilberforce launching off to the French Riviera. Don't you wish you could go with him? All right, any questions?